Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in system-centered technologies. Today's discussion will be part 2 of a series of sessions focusing on compliance settings in Configuration Manager 2012. Today's session will specifically focus on the various detection options that can be leveraged in compliance settings. So here's a bit of an agenda. What we want to do, first I just want to talk about a few of the options available as a part of the broader set of compliance settings, just as way of illustration of other things besides what we're going to focus on. Won't spend a ton of time there. Then I want to talk specifically about configuration items. Right? This is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time in the discussion today. We'll then tie that to baselines and talk about deployment options, then finally look at the results that we can get after running through all these things and wrap up from there. Again, this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. So let's talk about options for a minute. In Configuration Manager Compliance Settings node, if you look there, which we will in a second, you will see that there are several items that we can actually choose to configure in your environment. We'll look at some of them briefly. We're going to focus specifically on configuration items and baselines. So there are a number of other items: user data and profiles, remote connection profiles, compliance policies, conditional access, company resource access. Right. So let's quickly just tour what those are. We may at some point in the series come back through them and spend some more time on them. But for now, let's just introduce. So here's configuration items and baselines. We're going to spend the bulk of our time here. You see some demos I'll put together there. We'll come back to them. So in terms of user data and profiles, so all of these are under compliance settings. Remember, the compliance settings as an umbrella is just trying to provide you the ability to configure settings in your environment you want to make sure that the various devices adhere to as they come online, as they interact with your network. So for specifically user data and profiles, if we go through there, even just stop on the screen, we see what we have here. So the first option is for folder redirection, another offline files, and another roaming user profiles. These are things that we hear from time to time and are part of a IT administrator's life, figuring out what to do with folder redirection. That's kind of like mapping a user's home drive in some ways. Offline files, dealing with these things. Config Manager lets you do that here and apply it to the managed devices. So here, for example, you can choose what to do, folders to redirect, all of them, none of them, whatever. So I'll just choose one so I can move past it. And then redirect to either a specified folder or the user's home drive, whatever. I said home drive. Redirect to the user's home drive is what I meant. Other things here, so offline files. If you want to manage offline files, enable that. We can do it here, discuss how we want to do it, add any kind of paths and so on for offline files and so on. Roaming profiles, how we want to handle those, folders excluded, folders or subfolders and so on, right? And that's it. But this is a pretty cool way to be able to manage these items. Next in the list is remote connection profiles. If we go there, then just type in test here again so we can move on. Here we see that we have the ability to specify a remote gateway and how we have our connection settings and all of those kinds of things on machines. So we have a uniform way to set those, right? There are other ways to set some of these for sure, but for managed machines, it makes a lot of sense to do it here. So compliance policies. So this, move on real quick, notice the supported platforms. These really are all mobile devices, and as you go through them, you will see that there are a couple of different ones that will show up for some devices and not others. There's not a ton here, but there are some interesting ones, such as password settings, password length, whether you want to allow jailbroken or rooted devices, and those kinds of things, right? You can set all that here. Finally, conditional access. Now, this is something you can configure here, but it is something that is actually delivered by Intune. So what this really is mobile devices connecting to your infrastructure. How do you want to handle them? There are entry points for mobile devices in Exchange and SharePoint and so on. And as those devices come in, you can specify access policies that you want to give them, right? So this is just connecting to Intune. right here. If you have on-premise Exchange, you can do it too. So conditional access for on-premise Exchange. I'll just move on to test so I can get past the screen. There. Okay. And then I can add in the things that I care about. So maybe a user collection, all users. Cool, move on. Next. And then any excluded collections, and then user notification, and so on. So this will enforce the user when they come in to have to adhere to the policies here. Company resource access. This is the last group. And so if you are managing certs or email profiles or want to pre-configure VPN or Wi-Fi profiles, this is the way you can do it. Right, again, really quick overview of those items. We may or may not, I haven't decided yet, come back and talk about those in more detail, but wanted to at least highlight them here. They are under the larger umbrella of compliance settings. But again, here's where we're going to spend our time. So let me pull the lab back out for a minute. Go back in here. And let's talk about configuration items. So first thing, as we get rolling, the idea of building configuration items, that could really enter into a strategy discussion, and we're not really going to go on that road today. But for now, I do want to at least share a little bit about this. So the specific comment here, as I go through the demos that we're going to see in this section, you're going to see one particular configuration item having one setting inside of it. So in other words, there's a number of settings, you'll see them on the screen in just a second, that you can configure inside a configuration item, and then either have that be the only setting inside a configuration item, or you could actually have a configuration item with multiple settings. There really is no right or wrong. What it really depends on is what you need, right? So in my case, I'm going to do them whether one configuration item equals one setting. But in practice, you probably will see situations where that's not the case. So if you recall our discussion in session 1, where we were talking about the Security and Compliance Manager Solution Accelerator, there are examples in there that definitely have a single configuration item containing multiple settings. And the settings may be, and probably are in many cases, of mixed type. So think about configuration items this way. You're defining with a configuration item a unit of configuration that you're trying to check against a machine, against a device. So if you're checking the health of a service, as an example, there might be a couple of different things that you need to check. Maybe you need to check a .NET assembly version. Maybe you need to check a registry key. Maybe you need to check a file version, and so on, to check the health of that service. Those are 3 different types of settings that all can go into a single configuration item, because that single configuration item is going to check for the health of that service. If one of those settings is sufficient to check, then that's fine. It really is up to you how you build this out. To go back to the discussion that we had last time, I kind of like to think of configuration items as books on a shelf in a library. The books themselves define information, and but by themselves they don't do anything. They have to be carried onto into the environment by something. That something is the bookshelf. Again, not to belabor that, but if I should say, configuration items by themselves don't do anything. They're just where you define what to do, and then you enter those into the environment differently with baselines and deployments and so on. Enough about that. So let's go through this. So in terms of the configuration items that are available, here they are. I'll just lay them on out. Active Directory, you have assemblies, you have files and folders, and the IIS metabase, registry keys or values, SQL, WQL, XPath, XML, or script. I want to take you through all of these, right? And one of the concepts you'll see through all of these, really, most of these, there's some exceptions, is the concept of how we check for a specific configuration. There's 2 ways, generically. One is what we call existential, meaning you want to check to see if a particular setting is present. You don't really care what it's set to. You just want to know, is it present in the environment? That's one way that you can employ configurations on these. Again, you'll see it. Even with a simple test to find out if a setting exists, there's a couple of different options, right? One is you can specify that the setting must exist, otherwise the setting's out of compliance. Or you can say the setting must not exist, otherwise you're out of compliance. Or you may need to check multiple instances of a particular setting. You can do that too. Those are all, does the setting exist, does it not, kind of test. The other is value detection, right? There's multiple ways that we can check for values depending on the configuration item we're defining. The setting probably is better said that we're defining. All right, we'll go through each one of those. There are some capabilities to remediate mismatched values through this. You can't mismatch existential checking, or you can't remediate existential checking. You can remediate if you have a value mismatch on 3 of these. So specifically on registry, WQL, and in script, you have the ability to remediate. I guess with script you could even remediate existential now that I think about it, but that would be in code. All right, so the easiest way to really understand these is to talk about them. So let's just start in order, and I'm going to go down the list mostly as it appears in the console. Script will be last, but just talk about all these. So to do that, let's pull back in the lab and we'll just walk through them. So the first one that we want to talk about is Active Directory, right? With Active Directory, we have a lot of information that we might want to be able to check on, to validate, so on, right? So with Active Directory, typically we think of our target being domain controllers. That's a theme you're going to hear throughout this, right? Think about your target for a particular settings check. For example, AD. Probably doesn't make a ton of sense to run against a non-DC. Maybe it does, depending. But some settings for sure don't make sense to run against a system that doesn't have the capability to have that setting. Think of SQL. Think of maybe IIS, right? If the system that you're targeting don't have those components, doesn't have those components, then you know your compliance is going to fail. So think about targeting as we go through each one of these. Some apply, most apply generically, some don't, right? So with Active Directory, specifically, we can check an existence of an AD value. We can check for a specific AD value, right? So let's set up a scenario. So here's my setting. Before I go into it, I'm going to pull in my domain controller. So this is my domain controller. I'll restart you later. So if I look in my domain controller and I want to determine what I need to look for, there's a nice little tool here called ADSI Edit. And it lets me explore the pieces of my directory for items that might be pivotal. So it could be some application requires a certain configuration in AD. You want to make sure that's set the right way. Maybe there's something that you want to make sure does not get entered into the directory by accident, whatever the scenario. So ADSI Edit lets you browse. Be careful here. It's a really neat tool, cool tool, but it's also one that'll let you do some things maybe that would not be so nice. So I'm just going to focus on policies, right? So if I look at policies and look at properties, there are certain things that I might care about, right? So in this example, I'm going to specifically focus on the policies object. Well, how do I focus? How do I tell ConfigMgr to look up this specific object? The first thing that you'll see is I have to give it a distinguished name. So this is something you'll type into, or you will see that I've typed into the configuration. The other is what value do I want to look at? So in my case, just because it's here, I'm going to check the value of this is critical system object. Actually, I'm just going to check to make sure it's here, right? So hopefully you get the idea. You can check whatever object properties you want, whatever object you want, the way you need to, right? This is just an example. So that said, let's go ahead and actually pull in ConfigMgr and look at the setting. So here under settings, I'm going to detect the AD item, and you notice that what I've done is I've pulled in that distinguished name. I've told it what search filter, basically search for all of it. There's 3 search criteria, either base, one level, or subtree, underneath. I chose this. And then the query, the ultimate LDAP query, is crafted for you, which is good because these still confuse me a bit. And I don't have to worry about typos. But this is what it would look like, right? So one of the goals of going through all this is to show you the options, but also it's to document how you do this. So as I've spent some time working with compliance settings and specifically look for different examples for some of the more corner type detection scenarios, I didn't find a lot of them, so I had to struggle a bit with it. And that's what I wanted to do here, is kind of walk through every option that we have, show how it works, to give you a chance to have a documented resource where you can go back to it in case you run into any kind of configuration issues, syntax issues, whatever. At least you can see how this works, right? So this is a working setting. So this is telling the specific setting is telling what to look for, and then you need to say how to look for it or what to do with it once you inspect it. That's compliance rules, right? So this is an existing rule. I can pop it up. You can see it, right? This is just an existence rule, an existential rule. So in my case, I'm saying the setting must exist, or I can choose setting must not exist, or it has to occur a number of times. This will be very common as we go through this, right? In my case, I'm just going to pop up a new one. So I can either choose exists or I can choose a value. If I choose to go all the way down to the value level, I have the various operators you might expect, including contains, right? But in this case, I just want to check if it exists. So that's configured. And this one is actually one that I, on purpose, want to fail here. So it won't work on this client, although it is properly configured, as you will see later on. I'm just going to go into my control panel, open ConfigMgr, and run this. So I'm going to go to my configurations. All these are down here. Here's Active Directory. You see that it's in an error state on purpose. The rest are compliant. Kind of will get boring a little bit going through these, seeing that they're all in compliance. But I'll evaluate it. And it returns an error, right? So I'll do this a couple of times because I'm trying to illustrate something that I'll tell you about later. But there's a change between 2007 and 2012 in how the evaluations work, right? So I'm evaluating. You keep seeing the time updating again. Maybe that's enough to tell you what it is, but I'll go back and tell you specifically a little bit later. Well, heck, I'll tell you now. So one of the cool things about 2012 is that this is real time. So if I were to go in here, run this check, and it fails or gives me an error, and then I go in and fix the problem and run it again, it will detect that and immediately flip to the new state. That was not the way it worked in 2007. There would be a delay before we would actually process anything and show you the new results, right? So that's very good from the perspective of an administrator working on a system that they own, trying to make sure their system complies with the various settings that have been put out there, right? Okay, so that's AD. Right, we'll show an example of this where I promise you it will work as we get to the end, so you know that I didn't just misconfigure something. Okay, so let's just keep going through these. So the next one in line is assembly. Right, so oops, clicked the wrong button and got the lab out of the picture. Let's pull it back in. So is assembly. So what is an assembly? First of all, why do you care? Right, so in this world of .NET, we have certain components that might be shared in common. Those are called assemblies. Think of assemblies as just a library of code that .NET applications might make use of. That's certainly what it is. Well, there could be certain applications that require certain versions of these libraries called assemblies. And so you might want to validate on systems whether the correct version of the assembly is present, right? This, as an example. So let me show you the assemblies. So if I go open File Explorer, and the target for this thing, so we talked about AD, maybe having a limited target. You want to specify systems where it makes sense to check an AD item. Here, every Windows system has an assembly cache. Every Windows system has an assembly cache. So if I just do a percent system root percent, which translates to Windows, and look for assembly here, this will open my assembly cache. And so you, come on, click. And so you will see here just all of the various assemblies that are in here. We will have a version, we will have a culture item, a public key token, whatever. So just say this one, I forget which one I picked. Say this one is really important to you. You might want to make sure, first of all, the assembly exists. That's the existential version. Make sure it's at a particular version, has a particular public key token. If any of those are out of what the expectation would be, then maybe the application that depends on this may have a problem. Maybe you want to know that, right? How do you configure it? It's actually really pretty easy. So if you go to the detect assembly, I'm just checking to see if it exists again, and go to properties. Same kind of thing. I'm checking the setting, pop it up. It's really easy. You just specify the name of the assembly, right? And then you go into compliance rules and you decide what will be checked. So here I'm checking a specific version of it to make sure that it equals 3.000, right? Well, there's other things I could check too. So if I just click new, then I could also check culture or public key token, right? And then I have all the operators. Or I could just choose to make sure it exists. Then we have the same familiar options we just saw, right? Okay, and so this works as well. Again, gets a little bit boring as we go through this, and I just keep clicking it again and again, but nevertheless, assembly, evaluate, and in fact, it's compliant, right? So good enough. We know that's the proper format, and that works. Okay, so that's assembly. What's next? In the list, we have a file or folder, right? The file system, things that we want to check. So if I look under file, let's sort this again. I'm going to check for a specific value. But let's look at how we can actually look at this. There's a couple of interesting options on this. Again, this could apply to any system you want to check, right? Any Windows system has files and folders. So under our settings, I'm just going to simply detect whether a folder exists, right? So you notice these are gray. Once they're configured, I can't change them. There's certain things that I can. But there's a folder out here that I have uniquely on this system that contains some of the things I'm using in demo. So I'm using this folder first for demo. Then I'm going to use this XML file a bit later for demo. So I'm just going to check to see if this folder exists, right? So before I do that, though, let me just show you the options. So if I click New and tell it that I want a new setting, then I can say, again, File System, and then say either File or Folder. So I chose Folder. I could just as easily choose File. So let's do that real quick. So I'll just say that and then say Test down here. Again, I'm not going to save it. Doesn't matter. So I'm saying look specifically for a file named Test, right? And then compliance rules lets me define how I want to look for it. So I've defined to look at the file, and I can either do the existential, meaning it exists and the criteria there, or I can choose value. But notice for value, I have a number of different options. So I can look at all of these: date modified, created, size, product name, file version, company, hash, right? And any one of these that I select, I can then choose the operator for comparison. But there's two other things here that are interesting. Attributes. So all files have attributes. And so you can validate whether those attributes are what you expect them to be. So it could be that you have some hidden files or some read-only files and you're concerned to make sure they stay in that form. And so you want to create a test to look specifically at those things and report back if something's out of compliance. Easy enough to do right here, right? Or maybe there's something that you've permissioned a certain way and you want to make sure and test that that remains permissioned in that way. Easy enough to do here, right? Just specify the user, what permission level they should have. We'll check and make sure. If it's out of compliance, we'll let you know. Okay. Or, so we did that. You can go back to the file, make this a folder. Don't really have to change anything here, right? Just the path might be different. You might have switched this up a bit, but this configuration is certainly suitable if it applies. And here we do the same thing. We can either check existence, okay, or check a value. And in this case, we have multiple values as well. Date created and modified, or attributes of the folder, and permissions of the folder. Okay. So what I did simply was, I believe, check the existence of this folder here. Yeah. Or check the value is greater than this, right? It was created later than this date. So that's what I'm looking for. And it's deployed. It's out there. I can run through it. You will see, in fact, that this is compliant. So here's my file check. Evaluate it. And easy enough, I'm good. All right? Now pay attention to this one, because let me pull that back up. Because I'll show you in a minute a system where this is not compliant, just, again, to prove kind of how this works and so on. All right, let me go back there. Cool, move that out of the way. All right, so working on down. So next would be the IIS metabase. So let me shift this for a second. I have to pull the lab back up in a minute, but I'm adjusting something here on the side real quick. All right, so let me go back to the lab. Cool. So the IIS metabase. Right? So target for evaluating the IIS metabase would obviously be a system that has IIS on it, right? Because you want to look specifically at the metabase. If you're going to look at IIS and the metabase, you've got to have metabase compatibility turned on. So specifically to test that, we'll go into Server Manager and add roles and features. This is a ConfigMgr server, so it does have IIS. It's all in one. So it will have IIS. Here's web server. So if I scroll on down, here's my management tools. And notice that I have IIS management compatibility and so on. Here's the metabase compatibility. That is turned on. So in IIS 6 and above, we don't use the metabase by default, right? We use instead XML files. And XML files, we'll see an example of how you can read an XML file in a little bit. And so if you prefer to go that way, then that's cool. But if you want to specifically mine data out of the metabase, then you have to turn on metabase compatibility, IIS 6 and above. If you're below IIS 6, which hopefully you're not, but if you are, the metabase does still exist, and you can just query it, right? So once you have metabase compatibility turned on, then you have to be able to browse the metabase to see what you want to actually check. So if you install the IIS resource kit, then you can find Metabase Explorer, right? Little tool here, so it's launching. And this is where I had it open up to last. This is my metabase. And it's just a matter of point and clicking, opening what you want, finding the setting that you care about, and then you can create that path inside your configuration manager configuration for that item. So let me just pull this to the side as I go look at the metabase item. I think I pulled up the wrong one. Yeah, I did. Okay, open up metabase. So then I'll minimize the main console so I can kind of put these side by side, right? So specifically, the setting that I want to check for is this one called path. So how do I define that in here, looking at the metabase? Pretty easy, actually. All I need to do is know what path that particular item is on, and then I define it. So here is LM W3SVC1 root. LM W3SVC1 root. That's the location where my object is found. And then I don't call it path. I just have to use the object ID, property ID here. So I'm going to check 3001, which happens to be the path property. So this is what I'm going to look at. The compliance rules will tell me how I'm going to look at it. So again, I can choose either a value or exists, right? And so for a value, it's just a matter of putting in the operator you want and the value you want. In my case, I chose to just look for inet pub ww root just like it should be. And so here, when I evaluate it, it should work just fine. Okay, IIS metabase, and off you go, evaluate, and we are compliant. Right? Okay, so cool. So let's move out of that one and move on. So I'll cancel out of here. Now let's go to one that is probably a good starting place for most people. This is where I started. You know, a lot of times people either start with creating a registry rule or a file system rule because those seem more familiar maybe, and that's cool. But with registry, we have actually a couple of different options. We either can look specifically at a key or we can look specifically at a value. So I've got both defined here. With a key, we can both look for the existence of the key, and we can also look at other things too, as I recall. So here's the key that we're defining. So here we can look at all of the hives, including the user hive, right? Define what key I want to look at, then how I want to look at it. So this is just an existential option. Notice this is not available, right? Registry is the only place where this third option is not available. But I don't have to just look at exists. I can also look at value, right? So does a key have a value? Well, you don't think about it, equaling something. A key doesn't equal anything, but a key does have a value in terms of permissions, right? So I can look right here and see if the permissions on a register key are set appropriately, and if not, report back. All right, another thing, so enough there, right? So exists or value. Okay, now there's the other one that we have for the registry key as well, and it's down here where specifically we're going to look at a value in the registry. So here we are looking at the exact same location, right? It's just here I'm specifying a test value, and then I tell how I want to look for it. 1, 2, 3, 4 is what it should look like, right? So I'm testing the value. But if I look specifically here, I can either check exists, again, same thing, this third one's grayed out, or I can check a value. With value, I just have the operators here, right? So pretty easy, just specify what the value is, the operator, and off you go. But notice this. This is the very first time that I've had an option for remediate non-compliant rules when supported. I mentioned when we got started there are 3 places where you can remediate: registry, WQL, and script. Here's your first instance, right? So if you want to remediate automatically whenever we encounter an out of compliance, you have to put a checkbox here. But selecting the checkbox here is not enough by itself to cause us to automatically remediate. You also have to set it elsewhere. I'll show you that as we move along, right? But this is certainly where you would have to do it, at least to enable the possibility of doing remediation, right? All right, good enough. So let's actually look at these work. Again, it's just going to say compliant, so it kind of gets a little bit boring, but just to follow it on through. So here I'll go to registry key, evaluate it, it'll do that, come back compliant. Look for the registry value, evaluate that, it will come back compliant, right? Okay, so keep these in mind because we'll have another system where this won't come back compliant in a bit. So we're going to skip script for now. We'll go ahead and do it. No, we'll skip it. So next in line would be SQL, right? So I want to know if a value in SQL exists or if it's set a certain way. I can do both options. So the target here obviously would be systems that are SQL servers, right? So let me show you, first of all, SQL. Here's Management Studio, good enough. Open it up and get ready. All right, so let me pull open the rule first. Okay, so if I look at my setting, right, here's what I'm going to be checking. So in the SQL configuration, I can specify what instance I care about, either default, all, or a specific one. I specify the database that I care about, and then the item inside the database. This gets potentially a little confusing, so I want to explain it. First, notice that I'm using the ConfigMgr database just because it's convenient. I don't have to. You could scavenge a lot of settings just out of SQL to make sure it's configured right, just by reading the master database, right? So let me run this in SQL, right? So notice what it's asking for. What column do you want to check for the value, or to exist, or for the value that you're interested in, right? How do you know what column to actually choose? Right? Well, let's just run the query and I'll show you. So if I select new query and paste in the exact query that I put inside the configuration, okay, so I have to run it against the ConfigMgr database, right? So in this case, I'm just making sure that the version of ConfigMgr is what I expect. So I'm going to execute this. Notice what happens. The actual data that's returned comes back as a column. There is a name associated with it. So now I could take this out. So I will take this out. Notice that I'm casting the result as a specific name. I'm telling it to name the column version. If I don't, if I just run this, then the column itself will be named string1. So in my configuration, I would need to check a column named string1, right? Because that is what we have here. Hope that makes sense, right? So here, just so I always know what the value should be in the query, I just cast the specific return column as a specific name right here. And then the rest of the query is just looking for the detail that I care about. In this case, there's an entry called version, right? Cool, and it's going to be 8239. Well, if I go back to Configuration Manager then, and look further, and go to compliance rules, this one is just checking to see if that value exists, right? All of these are available, and I'm going to check to make sure it's there. If it's there, cool, we passed this one. Well, there's this other one that we can look at where we're looking for a specific value. Get rid of this right now. Looking for that to have a specific value, in this case 8239. So we'll look at that one too. Configured essentially the same way, but just a little bit different because we're looking for the value. Same exact query, right? And the compliance rule is just an equals, right? Has to equal this particular value. So in my case it does, and so if I run both of these, both will run and both will return success or compliant. Evaluate compliant, evaluate compliant, right? Okay. So cool. Move on to WMI. So being able to query WMI is also very important. Lots of detail in WMI. We can check the value. We can check for existence. So let's go do that. Let me move something on a different monitor down a little bit, and then I'll go back to the lab. All right, good enough. Okay, so with WQL, the target, any system, any Windows system today has WMI, so any one of them could be your target. So we're just going to simply specify the query. Now this one is a bit interesting. Again, want to show you a little bit of explanation here. So I'm going to go to WebMTest. The reason I want to explain this is, at least for me, whenever I was looking for examples of this online, the ones that I mainly found showed the property name being the same as what we have here. So this is actually a really nice UI to craft a WQL query. We're going to tell it the namespace, the class in that namespace we care about, and the property to key off of that we want to find, right? We care about knowing what the information is about this particular property. So in order to hone in on this particular property, we're going to specify a clause, a where clause, to identify the specific item where we want to know this property, right? So for Win32 computer system, not the best example, but let me show you anyway. Let me connect up to this namespace. enter this exact query. So select star from Win32 underscore computer system. All right. And what you're going to notice, we come back with exactly one entry. Why? Because you can only have one computer system here, right? The name is the name of my system. So I'm going to filter the list. So let's just assume that we had 5 or 6 entries here. I would want to hone in specifically on the one that has the name Steve Rack-CM. So once I hone in and pick this one out of my list of potentially 5 or 6, then I have a property on this item that I care about, which is model, right here. So that's what this is doing. This allows me to focus which particular item out of the list I want, and then pull the property off of that item, right? So if we think about, again, one item here, one computer system, probably not the best example, but if we think forward in terms of ConfigMgr, lots of examples of how this could be useful. So if you look at the list of software updates on a system, you will have hundreds potentially. You could use a filter criteria like this, the where clause, to hone in on a specific software update that you might be interested in, and then pull detail properties off of it. If you want to look at maintenance windows and just check compliance or create a rule, if you will, compliance rule, to check to make sure certain maintenance windows are in place, you could do that. Maybe there's 5 or 6 maintenance windows. You want to check a particular one, make sure that it's set for a certain time of day. Then you could use something like this to filter to that one, find that property, make sure it's set the right way, and so on, right? And certainly there are ConfigMgr examples as well. Hope that makes sense. So if we look further, this is defining again what to look for. This is defining how to look for it, just simply that this item has to exist in order to be compliant. Or we could go to our value example, where we need for it to be specifically a certain value, in this case virtual machine. Here's the exact same query that I had, right? And then this time the compliance rule is equals virtual machine, right? Okay, and notice this, remediation, non-compliance. So this is the other place, or the second place where we can remediate a non-compliant rule when it's supported. All right, so we run this, no big deal, and it should work for us. Okay, so WQL exists, evaluate, yes, we're compliant, good to go. WQL value, evaluate, yes, it's compliant, good to go. All right. So let's continue on. So have just a couple left. Then we have XML. Right. So XML has become all the rage these days, and it's very, very useful for storing information and doing it in an orderly way and so on. It's sometimes hard to read XML. If you're not familiar with reading XML, it can be a little bit of a challenge to understand all the pieces. So let me show you first a little 2 or 3 minute discussion of how to read XML. Certainly not going to get into the nitty gritty, but it's pretty easy to understand if you know the structure, right? So let me pull up, minimize this, get rid of that. Yeah, I want to, here. No, I don't want to save changes, get rid of that. Okay, so let me pull up my folder that contains my test XML, right? So if I go to compliance settings demo, there's an XML file in here. I could just open this up, and it is fairly readable, pretty easy to read in IE, right? This is a very small XML file. If you get a larger XML file, it's harder to navigate in here. Really, the best thing you could do is have a good XML reader. IE does a pretty good job. The one thing about XML, so let me go ahead and open it in this other one. So I like Notepad 2. So I'm going to pull it up to Notepad 2 and open it up. Similar view, right? So really the first thing to understand about XML is how important it is to actually indent your entries. I've come across XML files in the past where there's no indenting, or maybe the editor that has opened the XML doesn't provide for the indentions at all, and it's just so painful to read, right? I've seen people that have crafted XMLs and did not put in indentions, and it's just incredibly painful to read. So like with any code, if you're building it, please put indentions in there. It's just going to make your life and everyone else's life easier. But here's how XML works, basically in a very brief nutshell, and certainly not covering all of it. There's a particular structure to XML. There's what's called, for a section, an opening tag, and then as you open a section, you'll have configuration details inside of it. Once you're done, you'll have to close it. So we have our computer alias in the greater than less than brackets. We close it by having computer alias down below with the preceding slash. Well, notice that these don't seem to have any slashes, but they really do, because really there's nothing to put. So there's the name, and then within the same greater than less than brackets there's a slash, which both opens and closes that section. Another very valid way to do this would be to simply do this. That would be very valid, right? And one reason I really like editors like this is because it does change the color based on what is expected for a given type of file, right? So you know whether you're kind of on track or not. This is exactly the same kind of thing as this. It's just this is shorter, right? Less typing. So here we open computer name, close it, there's no detail. Here we open domain, close it, no detail. Forest, close it, no detail. But we do have detail for data server. So inside this section, we're creating or defining a value for data server transport. Here, defining that section, closing it. Data server address, defining that section, giving a value, closing it. And on we go, right? So again, very simple. Hopefully that structure makes sense. So why do you need to know it? Well, very simply, as you're configuring the XML option to know how to actually path it out, you need to understand that. So let's go into XML for a minute. And so minimize that, pull it aside. So if I look at the settings and look here, it's pretty easy to understand. I just need to follow this tree down. So I'm going to start at computer alias, and then I'm going to go down to data server, and then I'm going to go down to data server address. This is the entry that I want. This is the entry I'm trying to scan this file to obtain. So just pathing it out directly to that entry allows me to point specifically inside the XML to the area I want. Now it's just a matter of setting the compliance rules. In this case, I'm telling it has to equal a certain value, right? Or I could tell it just exist and it would do the same thing, right? Okay, easy enough. Hopefully that makes sense. So we cancel out of that, get rid of this. No, I don't want to save changes, and then test. I'm just going to run, evaluate, and again, it works. No problem, right? So all that, those are the standard in-box canned options that we can use for detecting certain values. But what if what you need is actually not in the list of items that we can scan for? Or maybe it is, but your detection criteria is actually more advanced than what we have here. How do you handle that? Is it possible to handle it? Yes, it is, and that's why we give you the option for script, right? So script is very flexible, the most flexible. It's also completely on your own, right? So if we look at the script section here, there are three kinds of scripts we support: PowerShell, JavaScript, and VB script. And here we just have to tell the system what kind of script we want to use and then input it, right? So here I have a PowerShell script, and it's you notice there's two types. There's a discovery script and a remediation script. So I mentioned that with script you can also remediate. You can remediate whether an object exists. You can remediate a value of an object, right, or a setting. It's really up to you because you're writing the remediation script. You don't have to remediate. I don't have a script for that. I just have a discovery script. But there's a specific way in which you need to run the discovery script. So let me, before I show you the script, show you the compliance rule. Here I'm simply saying that the value must not exist. So this is, again, the first time you've seen different wording of this section. It's the same kind of thing, it's just worded a bit differently. So in order to be compliant, I expect that the script will not return any values at all. Knowing that tells me how I have to build the script. So if I go in here and look at the compliance rule, go back. Cancel that there. Look at my setting again. Edit the script. Very, very simple script. I'm just basically looking for the WordPad process and checking to see if it is suspended, right? And if it is suspended, I'm incrementing a counter, and then I'm checking to see if I have any increment of that counter. It's greater than 0. And if so, I'm going to set compliance to false. And then I'm going to output or return that value by using $compliance. Well, in my example, in order to be compliant, I don't want to return anything. So here I've set compliance to true, right? And then I'm running through the script to do my testing. If I actually do have an instance of this, then I am going to return a value, and that by itself is going to cause the script to be non-compliant. That's what I want. If I don't have any instances returned, then I just exit the script and I don't return anything from the script, and so I am in compliance, right? But the two have to work together to make sure the script is delivering what your, in this case, existence rule expects. So notice that this, I can launch WordPad all day. Let me go ahead and do that. And this rule will come back and return compliant, right? So let me just run the rule. I'll run this script exists evaluate. It's going to come back perfectly compliant. Well, that's weird, Steve. You have an instance of WordPad running. Yes, I do. But what is that script actually looking for? It's not looking for WordPad to not be running. It's looking for WordPad to not be suspended, right? So if I were to actually suspend WordPad, which I could do, and run this again, it would come back non-compliant. But since it's a running process, it passes on by, right? So this is interesting. This actually came out of a scenario I was working on with a customer to test for, it wasn't WordPad, but there was a process that seemed to be piling up on systems, and it was in a suspended state. So we checked with compliance rules and detected that condition, and then we have a remediation script that goes along with it to cause those processes to continue on through their loop and eventually exit, right? So this was very useful in this case. It didn't want to disturb any running processes, but those that were not running correctly, we did want to detect those and take action upon, right? Okay, so this is one option. Now you can also do where you're expecting a value. So the script will always return a value, either true or false. So you see I just have a little bit of a different script here. Here I have percent or $compliant set to true by default. If I encounter any conditions that are problematic, I'm going to set it to false here. And then regardless, I'm going to return the value from the script. So it's either going to be returned true or false. So I need to have a condition to detect for that, right? So that's my compliance rule where I'm specifying equals true. So if the result equals true, which is my default, then I pass on by. No problem, everything's fine, right? Okay, so let me just run this last one to show this is my script, my value, run that, and it's compliant. All right, so all that's really exciting. I told you I did this one on purpose to show an error. We'll get back to that in just a minute to illustrate why I did that. But let's just pull in the other machine in my lab, which in my case is a domain controller, and show these same rules running on that machine and the differences, right? So here's my configurations, and if I look, notice my AD rule or setting is actually compliant because it's a domain controller, because I have the ability to get in pretty easily and check that setting, right? My assembly is in error condition right now, and I'm not sure exactly why. I don't really care in this case. I didn't really want to use this anyway. My file is compliant. My registry key is non-compliant. My registry value is compliant. So there's a mix here, unknown for SQL and so on, right? There's no SQL server here, so you wouldn't expect there to be any kind of information here. The WQL entry that I'm looking for isn't here. The value is, the XML isn't here. There's an error. The file's not present, right? So all that to show these definitely are out there and reporting different results whenever we encounter a different configuration, although the rules are perfectly built and work just fine. All right, let's pull that back out. Okay, so another thing I want to show you before I leave here, right? So one of the things that's very useful for troubleshooting is to be able to come in and look at the detail behind the configuration. Configuring this in the UI is really good, right? And very easy to look at. But you can also view the XML definition. So this is where knowing how to read the XML, how to follow the sections, and so on, very useful, right? Tells you what namespace in WMI that the data is stored in, also gives you the specific identifier. If you're familiar with software updates, this string of text should look very familiar to you. This is the identifier for a configuration item. There's configuration items of different types all throughout the system. This is one for compliance settings. Software updates are defined as configuration items as well, and so they would look similar to this. It would be differently named, but it would look very similar, right? So being able to scroll through this, you know some detail about it, you know, the data that we're going to look for, how the system is going to situate it. You can come through, I'm not going to go through this in detail, maybe later, but you can come through and definitely see at this level the script body, right? And look through that, which is hard to read, but if you need to get the detail, it's actually here, and so on, right? All these different things, how we've configured it, okay? So pretty useful. And being able to follow the sections, in this case, a little bit more complex XML, pretty important. All right, cool. Well, let's pull that out and move forward. So that's the bulk of the time. We'll spend probably another 5-6 minutes and we'll finish up for this. All right. So we've defined now the configuration items. Having defined the configuration items does not matter at all, meaning they're not going to do anything until we actually place them into a delivery vehicle. That delivery vehicle is called a baseline. Here's the demos we just did. It's called a baseline. So we have to go through and talk about defining the baselines, right? So think of a baseline as a container. So a baseline essentially is a container that will hold the configurations that we want to evaluate, and that baseline will then be deployed to a client. So you could have a baseline that simply contains a single configuration item. You could have a baseline that contains multiple configuration items. You could have a baseline that contains software updates along with configuration items. You could have a baseline that contains other baselines, like you could have a parent baseline containing child baselines, right? Whatever you need to do, it's possible. Just know this. When we send out this baseline, all of the configuration items on it are evaluated in one pass. If any one of them shows non-compliant, then the baseline as a whole will show non-compliant. Okay? Not a big deal. We'll just do a couple of demos building a baseline, and then we'll view the XML on the baseline as well. So let's pull back in the lab. Here's my configuration baseline. Every one of these that you just saw, I put into its own baseline, right? Again, is there a need for a one-to-one relationship, one baseline to one setting? Absolutely not. I did it here for convenience. So I could just as easily go create a baseline, I will, that has multiple items on it. So I could create one that has configuration items. I can choose this one, add it. I can choose this one, add it. I can choose this one, add it. That's cool. Hit OK. Now I can add more things. I can go add software updates. Be careful here. Right? If you're adding software updates, double check your scenario, because generally it's better to let the system kind of take care of its own self in terms of software updates and such. But you can certainly add software updates to the list if you want to. Hopefully that'll come back. There we go. and pick and choose out of the library, right? So I can add this one, whatever I want, right? And so maybe, good scenario for this, maybe in order for a service to be up to date and running the right way, there might be a software update that needs to be in place. So you could check the configuration with the configuration item or two, check the version of a software update that's on the system, and if the combination of these items gel, we're good, right? Please don't, as I did a while back when I first started working with this, throw all of your software updates onto a baseline just to see what will happen. It will actually bog the system down quite a bit, and it may even time out because it takes so long to process, but that's where we learn our lessons, is playing in the lab. And then I can also add other configuration baselines if I want to. So this is a baseline, add that. That's a baseline, add that. And at the end of the day, I have a baseline that has a bunch of different items on it that I can go and deploy. I'm not going to save this one, but I could. Right? So on baselines, just like we would on individual CIs, I can view the XML definition. A little bit simpler XML here, but good to know the identifiers that we have here for troubleshooting and looking in the logs. Very much like software updates, you're not often going to find the friendly name of these items. You're going to find the identifier, and this is a good place to know what those identifiers are. You can also do that in the console, I believe. So CI unique ID is here, right? So you can scroll across and actually see that same detail here. If you don't want to dig into the XML, that's fine. But it's also exposed in the XML. All right, cool. So the other thing, which I could just do without pulling the lab back in or out, but I want to talk about deployment options, right? So targeting is a big deal. Scoping your collection so that it contains the items you actually want to evaluate and it makes sense to evaluate is important. Just like anything, just like any deployment, targeting it to a collection that is defined enough to receive that package or application or operating system deployment or whatever makes sense there, makes sense here, right? If you do include machines in the target that don't make any sense or can't possibly evaluate to true, then you know that you're always going to have that machine show up in either an error state, non-compliant, unknown, whatever it is, right? So what are your expectations for compliance? So if your item is found to be in compliance, big surprise, the result comes back compliant. If the item is not found to be compliant, but it's able to evaluate, then we're going to report non-compliant. We could also report an error. If there's some sort of challenge in evaluating a particular condition, we'll report an error. You can look at that and find out what's going on. We have an unknown you saw. We just don't know the result yet. We weren't able to get a result back, right? And then other options, right? So let me pull back in the lab. We'll talk about those. So once we craft our baselines, then we can deploy them. So I'll just pretend I'm going to deploy this one. It's already deployed, but I'll pretend anyway and go through. Really easy, right? So I choose which configuration baselines I want from the list. I can deploy multiple right here, whether or not I want to remediate. So I mentioned on the individual configuration items that you can choose to allow remediation. Doesn't mean they're going to be automatically remediated. You also have to choose here to allow for that remediation. If something goes wrong, you can send an alert. Here's where we choose our collections. We can certainly target to users or devices, right? And then also the schedule. So the default schedule is going to inherit from the client settings of once every 7 days. You could change the client settings, but you can also change the schedule on the particular baseline. You can run baselines, so one baseline to evaluate every week, one baseline to evaluate every day, one baseline to evaluate every 3 days. Just, don't get crazy and go down to once every 1 minute or whatever. I don't know if you can even do that. But don't get crazy on the evaluation unless you're testing in a lab or whatever, because this can really cause problems with your system, right? Okay, so moving on. The next thing, how do we actually view the results of a compliance check, right? Well, first of all, on the client, I've already alluded to this, but let me show it to you again. We have the client control panel applet that any person can use as long as they have rights in here. Doesn't have to be a ConfigMgr administrator, right? Anyone that owns the machine and wants to can look at the deployed baselines, find out the ones that they are not compliant with, and start to work to try to remediate the problem. Here's the one that I told you I kept in an error condition on purpose. Why? Because I wanted to show you this report. So this is really a pretty nice report the end user can look at to determine what's wrong. So in this case, it just says, hey, I'm having trouble contacting the domain. Okay. Well, that's nice that they see this error. It gives us something to actually work on, point back to, and look at, right? Well, so just like on that system, I can pull this one in. We have a number of other things. Here, I'm having a problem evaluating the assembly. I can view the report on it, find out what's going on, right? Or what might be a challenge here. So we'll pull that up and then scroll down and see what the error is. Right? So error, hey, setting discovery error. This is a little bit more generic, gives you a code that you can look up, right? And try to diagnose the problem. Same thing here. Unknown. Script value. What do we have here? Oops. View report. So we see this actually came back to compliance. So maybe it just switched over. Let me see. Yeah, it just flipped to compliant. Let me check this one. And view report. Right. So in this case, we don't have a SQL server on the box, and so it's invalid. That doesn't make any sense. So on just the client side, we have some really nice troubleshooting tools that the owner of the server can use to see what's going on. Right? Let me close that. Done with it. All right. On the server side, we have the monitoring pane, and we also have reports. So if I go into monitoring here and look, then I'll see all the deployments that I've made. Configuration items are, or baselines are deployed just like anything else. You can go look at all your baselines. You can find out how compliant you are. Well, you saw some of them were compliant on both machines, so you get a result of 100%. You can see that some were an error, like the Active Directory one was an error. One of them is an error, one of them is compliant. So if I look at view status, I can tell what that is. It bubbles up here. So this machine was successful. This machine was a challenge, right? And it told me why. This specified domain either does not exist or cannot be contacted. So just like you saw in the report, right? Or in the client. And then I have reporting. I actually don't have reports enabled here, but we have a whole subsection of reports that are for compliance settings. Okay. So that's really it. That's the tour I wanted to do. And this part is to help you understand what the various settings are, by way of explanation, also by way of demonstration. If you need to go back to these, you're having trouble configuring them, now you have a full working list of how you configure them. Hopefully it will help address those challenges if you have them. We will continue on with this in session 3 and beyond, so we'll wrap it here, and we'll talk to you later.